The argument apologists likes to hear best from skeptics is the claim that they ain't no evidence for God. And the argument I like to hear best from apologists is when they suddenly want to split hairs over the definition of atheist. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. Last time we started what you might call part 2 of his book, where he switches from trying to make positive arguments for God to trying to debunk arguments against God. And the first argument was, as he calls it, the complaint that there ain't no evidence for God. Now, telling an apologist that there ain't no evidence for God is about the worst thing you could do if you don't want to spend the next few hours listening to them reciting every single apologetic argument they can think of. And Dr. Craig was quick to recommend that as the best Christian response. But the problem for believers ain't that the evidence is absent, it's that all of the relevant evidence is universally more consistent with the gospel being a myth than it is with the gospel being true. And that's what we as skeptics ought to be saying instead of trying to argue that the evidence ain't there. It's easier than trying to prove a negative to someone who thinks you can't prove a negative, and once you get the hang of seeing how the evidence is more consistent with God being a myth, you'll see that kind of evidence everywhere. And that's a more effective argument, because you ain't arguing over who has the burden of proof. You'll be enthusiastically seizing the burden of proof because you're going to be able to meet it. And that's going to make the apologist look bad when they tries to avoid having the burden of proof themselves, which by no coincidence whatsoever is exactly what Dr. Craig is going to try and do today. But he's going to do it by quibbling over the definition of the term atheist. Quote, atheism redefined as absence of belief. Very often, atheists themselves admit that they have no evidence of God's absence, but they try to put a different spin on it. They'll tell you no one can prove a universal negative like there is no God. They think that this somehow excuses them from needing evidence against God's existence. End quote. And notice that word redefined in the section header. He's up to his usual shenanigans trying to make it sound like atheists is retreating and looking for some way to escape from the apologist's irresistible logic. That ain't his main point here, but he's trying to set a suitably triumphant tone. His main goal here is to establish the presumption that atheists has the burden of proof. The default conclusion is supposedly that God does exist unless and until the atheist can prove that he don't. And this matches the believer's expectations. The believer wants to believe that God does exist, so what better way to set up the argument than to make God's existence the default assumption? It's like that meme where somebody calls Amazon customer service to report that their package was never delivered, and the customer service rep says, please provide proof of non-delivery. They ain't asking because they actually want proof. They's asking because they want us to say we can't prove it. Now, despite what Dr. Craig says, sometimes the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. If in the circumstances is such that it's reasonable to expect the evidence to be there, then the absence of evidence can be evidence of absence. For example, a tribe of 2 million some odd folks wandering the wilderness of Sinai for 40 years would reasonably be expected to leave a substantial amount of evidence in the form of their old campsites and their garbage dumps and broken pottery and discarded shoes and on and on. The absence of such evidence is reasonable evidence that the Exodus never happened. We'd expect it to be there if the story was true, and it ain't there. And that goes double for evidence of an omnipotent, omniscient, all-wise, and all-loving God who wants us to know him and be with him forever. If a God like that existed, he'd dang well make sure that we had plenty of evidence for his existence. Heck, an apologist's entire career is based on claiming to have not just evidence, but convincing evidence that God does exist. If it was impossible for there to be evidence of God's existence, the apologist wouldn't have nothing to say. So it is reasonable to expect evidence for God's existence, and therefore this is one of them cases where absence of evidence is evidence of absence. At this point, Dr. Craig pulls off an interesting bit of misdirection. He admits that it is possible to prove a negative, but he neatly avoids admitting that the absence of evidence can legitimately be evidence of absence. Quote, "But not only is it false that you can't prove a universal negative, all you have to do is show something is self-contradictory, but more importantly, this claim is really an admission that it's impossible to prove atheism." End quote. So Dr. Craig admits that you can prove a negative, but the only way he mentions for doing it is by showing an internal contradiction. But speaking of self-contradiction, did you notice the way that Dr. Craig is contradicting himself in this single sentence? He starts off by saying it's false that you can't prove a negative, and yet somehow by the end of the sentence, it's impossible to prove atheism because you can't prove a negative. And lest anyone accuse me of taking him out of context, here's the very next thing he says. Quote, "Atheism involves a universal negative. You can't prove a universal negative. Therefore, atheism is unprovable." End quote. He ain't saying that atheists is mistaken about believing that atheism is unprovable. He's saying atheism is unprovable because you can't prove a universal negative, even though he just got done saying that there's at least one way that you can prove a universal negative. To Dr. Craig, what's important is not whether the statement is true or false. All he cares about is how he can use the statement to make it look like atheists is wrong. They's wrong because they say you can't prove a negative, and they's also wrong because you can't prove a negative. And I think this is a good illustration of the difference between a debate and a scientific investigation. In science, you has to show that verifiable observations is more consistent with one conclusion than with another. But in a debate, all you got to do is make it sound like you're winning. And if the audience is on your side to begin with, like believers listening to Dr. Craig, they's going to be more than happy to take your tone of voice as an indication that you's really winning. Never mind that he's shifting the burden of proof onto folks that ain't convinced of his claims. Never mind that the evidence that should exist ain't there. Never mind that he's contradicting himself. All that matters is creating the general impression that some unnamed generic atheist somewheres is somehow admitting that they's wrong. And that's all that Dr. Craig is doing here, which means it must be about time for him to start gloating. Quote, "It turns out that it is the atheist who is believing a view for which there is and can be no evidence. This argument ought to be part of the Christian's apologetic arsenal! Exclamation point." End quote. Yeah, you just go right on ahead and add that one to your Christian apologetics arsenal. Because I ain't going to argue that there ain't no God, and I ain't going to argue that there ain't no evidence. I was going to argue that there's tons of evidence, and absolutely all of it is more consistent with the conclusion that God's a myth. And I was going to back up my arguments with verifiable evidence from real-world observations. And that's going to be a problem for anybody trying to follow Dr. Craig's scripts here, because his scripts is all about believers running away from the burden of proof and thinking that atheists don't want it neither. And I ain't running away from it. I was grabbing onto it with both paws because I love it. And honestly, I don't think Dr. Craig is prepared to handle that. Listen to how he tries to portray atheists as retreating and dodging. Quote, "What many atheists do at this point is to revise the definition of atheism so that it's no longer the view that God does not exist, but becomes merely the absence of belief in God. Anyone who lacks a belief in God counts as an atheist." End quote. Now, you may be wondering why someone like Dr. Craig would go to all the trouble of splitting hairs over the difference between saying, I believe God does not exist, and saying, I do not believe that God does exist. And of course, the answer boils down to the burden of proof. If I say I do not believe God does exist and you think he does, it's on you to convince me. And if I ain't convinced by your arguments, then I can still be an atheist. But if I say that I believe God does not exist, then you can say, okay, prove that he does not exist. And then all you has to do to remain a believer is to say, I ain't convinced by your arguments. And that's the goal here. Dr. Craig's official duties as an apologist is to give folks reasons to believe that God exists. And yet here he is running away from his responsibilities and trying to make it the atheist's job to convince folks. And I don't think he'd do that if he was confident in the evidence he claims to have for God's existence. It's kind of like if there was going to be a debate between Dr. Craig and some famous atheist, and Dr. Craig shows up carrying a little brass box about the size of a shoebox. And he says, well, I've got bad news for you, Mr. Atheist. Last night, God himself appeared to me in person, and he gave me this box. And inside this box is a proof of God so plain and undeniable that everyone who sees it will instantly become a believer. So the atheist says, well, all right then, open up the box and let's see it. And Dr. Craig clutches the box tightly to his chest and says, oh no, it ain't up to me to open the box. It's up to you to prove that the box is empty without opening it. Do you think he'd do something like that if the box really did have the kind of proof he claimed it did? I mean, that'd make him the most famous apologist in the whole world the minute he opened the box. It'd make his job a whole lot easier, too. He wouldn't have to try and wrap his head around the physics of Big Bang cosmology, and he wouldn't need to study Arabic so he could read the speculations of 12th century Muslim philosophers. He'd just go around showing folks what he's got in the box. And the fact that he don't do that is pretty convincing evidence that he himself does not believe that the box actually contains what he's claiming it does. The atheist would be well within his rights to respond, my proof is the fact that you ain't willing to open your own box. And that's more or less the situation we've got going on right here. Dr. Craig is trying to make it sound like atheists can't prove that his box of evidence is empty, and therefore he don't need to open up the box. He's moving the burden of proof onto whoever ain't convinced by his claims. And that, in and of itself, strongly suggests that he don't think his own evidence is really all that convincing. And I reckon he would know. From here, he descends into increasingly pointless quibbling over the definition of atheism as the absence of belief in God. Quote, this is not only contrary to the traditional meaning of the word, but it is really hopeless as a definition. For on this new definition, atheism is no longer a viewpoint or position. Rather, it's just a description of someone's psychological state, namely the state of lacking a belief in God. End quote. And I mean, yeah, technically we could call belief a psychological state, although if we're going to be all pedantic here, I might as well point out that technically atheism ain't a psychological state in and of itself, it's the absence of a particular state, namely the state of believing in the existence of one or more gods. But notice that Dr. Craig's argument here is based on the notion that atheism is a term that can only have one single definition that has to cover all possible uses of the term. The fact that atheism describes a lack of belief in God in no way precludes the possibility that we can also use the term atheistic to describe viewpoints and positions that deny or omit the existence of any gods. Folks can be atheists simply by virtue of not believing in any gods, and arguments can be atheistic by virtue of explaining things scientifically without resorting to any gods. And of course, a position or viewpoint can also be atheistic by making a positive claim that they ain't no gods, with the caveat that if we claim that they ain't no gods, it's fair to have folks ask us to provide evidence for our claims. Fair's fair. But that ain't going to help Dr. Craig as much as he thinks it does, because we ain't got to use the concept of atheism anywheres in our response to his claim that God exists. All we has to do is ask to see his evidence for his claims. And if he runs away from even allowing us to ask, he's justified in not believing his claims. And running away is exactly what he's doing when he says stuff like this. Quote, "All of this still leaves us wondering whether or not God exists. Call it atheism or Shmatheism. What we want to know is if God exists. And anyone who says he does not needs to have some evidence or arguments for his position." End quote. So ironically, he concludes by admitting that this whole contrived kerfluffle over definitions is completely irrelevant. Whether we says, "I don't believe there is a God," or we says, "I believe there ain't no God," we still atheists, and that don't change nothing. The important question is whether or not there's any good reason to believe apologists when they claim that he does exist. And the reason he's given here just ain't a good reason. I mean, let's try a few variations on his final declaration. What we want to know is if Santa Claus exists, and anyone who says he does not needs to have some evidence or arguments for his position. So if we ain't prepared to present a detailed and rigorous defense of the claim that Santa Claus does not exist, and by default we has to believe that he does. Or how about this? What we want to know is if an invisible fire-breathing dragons exist, and anyone who says that they don't needs to have evidence or arguments to support their claim. And no, you can't just claim that you ain't never seen one, because heck, they's invisible. You wouldn't. You has to provide convincing evidence or arguments that they don't exist, or else we's justified in assuming that they do exist by default. Or what we want to know is if spontaneous magical entropy reversal fields exist, and anyone who says they don't has to prove that they don't, or else they do. And so on, so on, so on. This argument is an attempt to justify believing in just about anything you want to believe in, especially if you make your beliefs unfalsifiable like apologists do with God. Dr. Craig ain't just asking skeptics to prove a negative, he's demanding that we either falsify the unfalsifiable or else concede that his claims is justified. And that ain't a reasonable demand. Now, I've mentioned before that apologists wants to convince us, and if they had any good arguments, they wouldn't need to use any of the bad ones. And this one right here is one of the worst. It's an abject appeal to outright gullibility, a demand that we believe whatever apologist tells us just because they says so, unless we can falsify the unfalsifiable. That ain't the path to true knowledge, it's just a tool to manipulate folks who's willingly gullible. I've been trying real hard here to give Dr. Craig the benefit of the doubt for the sake of Steelman and his positions as best I can, if for no other reason. But I gotta say, this particular line of reasoning is pretty hard to reconcile with the idea that Dr. Craig is making good faith efforts to arrive at the truth. The best I can manage is to assume that he's lying to himself first of all, and deliberately making himself more gullible than he normally would be so as to fit in better with his fellow believers. And it's certainly paid off for him in terms of having a financially successful ministry and such, so I suppose I can understand why he might want to do something like that. But still, this kind of worldview, using this kind of thinking as your method for determining what you call truth, just about the most counterproductive and self-defeating approach you could take, assuming you want an accurate understanding of objective reality. It's the exact opposite of testing your beliefs against the objective facts, and it's an outright refusal to learn anything you weren't already committed to believing. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. From here, Dr. Craig goes on to try and address the problem of suffering and evil, or at least the problem of suffering. And that's going to need at least one whole episode unto itself, because it's a masterclass in hand-waving distractions. You ain't going to want to miss it. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.